Before Ravenloft, and before Call of Cthulhu became a household name, 4 games tried to bring horror to the tabletop. But what did fear look like on a character sheet back then? Find out today on Daddy Rolled a 1. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, sometimes including Dungeons & Dragons. However, today we're going to be looking at 4 non-D&D games that brought horror to role-playing games as we know it. This is going to be part of my October 2025 series of horror-themed videos. So if you missed last week's look at the secret origins of D&D's Demons and Devils, you might want to check into that because it's been really popular on the channel. I go through the historical, folkloric, mythological, biblical, and pop culture origins that created some of D&D's Demons and Devils. But today we're going to be talking about 4 different role-playing games: Call of Cthulhu, Chill, Stalking the Night Fantastic, and Beyond the Supernatural. And this is going to be a non-TSR journey, the TSR being the company that published Dungeons & Dragons prior to Wizards of the Coast taking it over in 1997. So I'm going to be talking about how these 4 games expanded the medium beyond just swords and dragons and things like that. So in this particular video, by the end, you'll not only know where tabletop horror truly began, but also know how these games each approached fear in a radically different way, and how their mechanics can still inspire your old school games today, even if you choose to continue playing Dungeons & Dragons or another fantasy adventure game. We'll still get ideas out of these games that you can apply to your regular fantasy adventure games. And understanding these early horror RPGs, it really shows us how designers have grappled over time with making fear and sanity and the unknown part of the rules and not just part of the story. And some of their solutions were way ahead of their time and are still relevant today, 45 plus years later. So during the video, we're going to look at each game's origins, like how did they come about? Like, why was this game created? We're going to talk about the creators of each of the games and a little bit of their background and the companies that published them, because that's also important, because these are games that were being published not by TSR, but by other, and, in all cases, smaller role-playing game companies. But in a lot of cases, these smaller games ended up having a legacy that far outlasted, let's say, TSR, again, which went out of business effectively in 1997 when they were acquired. The name was around for a few more years before Wizards of the Coast stopped using it. But we're also going to talk about the rules, it's sort of an overview of the game. This is not intended to teach you how to play this game. It's intended to give you a flavor of what these rules are like and show you how they are different and how they handle different things from not only from each other, but also, again, I'm going to use D&D as sort of like the baseline of comparison, because that's probably the more popular game that people are at least aware of how to play. It's the one people usually, not always, but usually start with. So that it's a basis of context that we can have as far as talking about these different rules and mechanics for these different games. I'm going to talk about the tone of the game, because for all 4 of these, the tone is very, very different. And then the legacy. So we'll talk about the legacy of these games, like what is the impact that they had beyond just being published and up until today. And then again, we're going to dive into some of the ideas that you can take from all 4 of these different games and use them in your games today. So I am going to spend, I would say, the majority of the time on Call of Cthulhu. That is the most popular of these 4, and of the 4, it's one that is still published today by its original publisher, Chaosium, which is kind of cool. So it's been around for almost coming up on 45 years. So next year, 2026, will be 45 years for Call of Cthulhu, the role-playing game. Okay, and then I'll spend the second most amount of time on Chill. And then for Beyond the Supernatural and Stalking the Night Fantastic, I'll spend a little bit of time, but that'll kind of be a little bit less in-depth, because they just weren't as popular. And really, Call of Cthulhu was the first of these horror role-playing games. So it was kind of like everybody was sort of responding to it as they came out with their versions of the games. But if you like these kinds of deep dives into this history of our role-playing game hobby and these other games, besides just D&D, although I do have a lot of videos on the history of D&D here as well, then please take just a few seconds to like the video, double check to make sure you subscribe to the channel. And of course, you'll want to adjust the settings on that bell icon so that YouTube will notify you when I upload new videos. As a reminder, I typically upload new videos every week on Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And if I'm not going to be able to make that date, then I will leave a community post. And I'll try to post on social media as well to let people know that I'm going to miss that date. It's a quick introduction to horror role-playing games. I thought it would be fun to look at this book by Lawrence Schick. If you know the channel, you know your D&D history, you know Lawrence Schick is an important person involved in the early days of TSR and the development of role-playing games. But he wrote this book in, I believe, 1993. It's called Heroic Worlds, A History and Guide to Role-Playing Games. And this is kind of hard to get now. Unfortunately, I think there might be a newer version, but this is an original printing from, it looks like, 1991. And there, so one of the things that Lawrence does in here that I really appreciate sometimes, because it's just kind of more helpful, is instead of going by year, he goes by genre of games. And so we see here that horror role-playing games are going to be on page 238. And so he's going to introduce the idea of horror role-playing games and talk about, kind of some background. He says the first system in the genre was Sandy Peterson's Call of Cthulhu, which of course we're going to talk about here in just a minute. And then he talks a little bit about the background of Call of Cthulhu. I'm going to get into all of that later. And then he says the first major attempt to break Cthulhu's lock on the horror market came in 1984 when Pacesetter Games released Chill, of course, another game that we're going to talk about. And then he talks about the Ghostbusters role-playing game. We're not going to talk about that today. And then he also mentions, for those who want a serious horror game but aren't enamored of Lovecraft's betentacled nightmares, they should take a look at Beyond the Supernatural and GURPS Horror. I'm not going to talk about GURPS, but of course we are going to talk about Beyond the Supernatural. And so he organizes in here now. The other game that we are going to talk about here, as mentioned, is Stalking the Night Fantastic, which is going to be here. And so he says that it's an eccentric supernatural horror system in which the players are agents of Bureau 13, which is how the game's going to be renamed. So there is a little bit of an entry here for it. And he talks about it a little bit later with the expanded third edition, which again changes the name to Bureau 13. So I just thought it was fun that all of these games are listed in here because they are early examples of horror role-playing games. And now let's talk about our first of these games that we're going to be chatting about, which is the Call of Cthulhu, first published in 1981 by Chaosium. So we talked briefly about Chaosium before, and that was in my video where I talked about the history of the early California gaming community and how they impacted the future of role-playing games in general. Well, one of those companies was Chaosium, founded up in the Bay Area. And they're still around today, and they're still publishing Call of Cthulhu today in 2025. It is in its 7th edition. So obviously they had a very big impact on the role-playing industry as we know it, role-playing game industry. So very briefly, Chaosium as a company is created by a gentleman named Greg Stafford. So Greg actually was one of the players in Dave Hargrave's ARDUIN campaign. So you see how all this stuff is interconnected. I've recently been talking about ARDUIN a lot. They're doing a Kickstarter right now for a sort of a limited edition Kickstarter, reprinting the original 3 ARDUIN books in a special limited edition case, cover, and whatnot. And I'll put a link to that Kickstarter down below. But Greg Stafford was part of Dave Hargrave's group. But Greg originally was wanting to be a novelist, a fantasy author, had created a world called Glorantha, and he was writing stories in that, and he couldn't find someone to publish them. And he eventually is going to create a board game called White Bear and Red Moon, and that is going to take place in this world of Glorantha. And that is really kind of where you first see that world kind of come to life. That's 1975, so just a year after the publication of Dungeons and Dragons. And it gets some pretty good reviews. People really, really like it. Well, eventually he's going to work with some folks to publish a game called RuneQuest. And RuneQuest is going to take place in his world of Glorantha. And, I talked before, and this is going to be relevant here in just a second. But originally, Dave Stafford was going to publish Dave Hargrave's ARDUIN. That was the agreement that they had come to. But then when Dave Hargrave submitted his ARDUIN materials, Greg Stafford said that it wasn't really what he was looking for, because it was essentially, at the time, sort of just like a list of house rules for creating what people call a gonzo, or a very wild version of Dungeons and Dragons, very heavy science fantasy. And it was not really using an original system, and Greg Stafford didn't want that. And so he returned it and reneged his offer to Dave Hargrave to publish it. And so he's eventually then going to publish RuneQuest, which is sort of what I guess Greg Stafford was hoping that ARDUIN was going to be, but it's going to use his world of Glorantha. Well, RuneQuest is a custom new system. It's a skill-based system, and that's published in 1978. And in RuneQuest, there's a lot of things that are very, very important, specifically theme and story. They're very important. It's very into things like the world. It's a very detailed world, the religions, and how skills improve with experience, which is not something that we'd seen in games up to this point. There's a skill system in Traveler, but it's sort of like your skills are your skills, and then that's what they are. In RuneQuest, your skills improved as your character used them, and they get more experienced. And so these are elements that are very, very important to not only RuneQuest, but they're going to inform the entire list of offerings from Chaosium moving forward, because RuneQuest, the system for that was created for that, is eventually going to be turned into a sort of universal system called BRP, or basic role playing. And so it's important to understand that this emphasis on story and theme, a lot of people complain that modern games are like narrative and story based, and it's like, early players don't realize what it was like. Well, this is an early game, Call of Cthulhu 1981, and I would call this much more of a story based game than it is like a traditional war game rooted role-playing game. So they're going to create this system called BRP, basic role-playing. Now, you have two other people involved in the story for the creation of Call of Cthulhu, or well, more than two, but the first two we're going to talk about are Steve Lortz and his brother Kurt. And Steve was a miniature sculptor as well as a game designer, and he'd written articles in Different Worlds and in Worm's Footnotes, which was a publication put out by Chaosium, and worked on the Star Rover science fiction role-playing game with Dave Hargrave. Again, all these people are interconnected up there in the Bay Area. It was a very important part of the early gaming community outside of the Midwest, right? You've got Lake Geneva and Minneapolis. And then I would say like the Bay Area and really California as a whole is kind of like the third most important area if you're going to talk about them and try to rank them that way. So Steve and his brother Kurt, and Kurt had worked on a board game called Panzer Pranks, which was like a humorous sort of satire World War II parody game. And they came up with the idea of making a role-playing game based on H.P. Lovecraft. And so they talked to the folks at Chaosium, and Greg Stafford is very interested. And also Steve and Kurt were talking to the folks at Arkham House, who kind of owned the rights and the licenses to all the Lovecraft stuff and all the associated other properties that are kind of folded into Lovecraft. And so they start working on the game, and they create a system from scratch, and they send a roughly 200-page manuscript over to the folks at Chaosium and said, like, here's what we've come up with. And Greg Stafford doesn't like it because it's not what he was looking for. And he asked them to go back and use the BRP system and make it more closely related to the games that they were publishing, like RuneQuest. And Steve and Kurt say, no, they can't do that. It would take too long, and it would change way too much, that they'd already kind of gone down this path. And so they're kind of stuck, and they're in this middle ground. But then you have another character that's going to enter the scene, which is Sandy Peterson. Now, Sandy had worked with Greg Stafford and Chaosium on some stuff for RuneQuest, like Griffin Mountain, very popular supplement for RuneQuest, and also things like Cults of Terror. So he's going to approach then Greg Stafford and say that he wants to work on a Lovecraft game. And, Chaosium had the license because they've been working on it with Steve and Kurt Lortz. And so Sandy's going to say, okay. And Greg's going to agree that they want to do this game. And so Sandy's going to write it in the BRP system. And so Greg and Chaos, they're going to shelve Dark Worlds and they're never going to publish it. And as far as I know, it never got published and released to the general public. If anybody knows different, let me know in the comments below. But, you know, again, this is the second time that we're seeing this from Greg Stafford, that he's, you know, talking to people and saying, well, I want you to make this game. And then they make it. And, you know, you'd think there should have been a point where they would come to agreement, like, this is what we want it to look like, so that people don't go down the path of creating something and writing something to have Greg pass on it. Now, I'm not blaming Greg Stafford. He is still with us. Steve and Kurt Lortz, unfortunately, are not. They've both passed away. But, you know, this was sort of like this really Wild West period of role-playing games where I think, you know, a lot of these people are gamers, not business people, and it doesn't occur to them to like have things like kind of mapped out so that you know what you're getting into. But in any event, that's how we get this version of Call of Cthulhu. Now, it's originally released as a box set. I believe the first two editions, first and second, are box sets, starting with the third edition, which is going to be the one that I'm going to go through because that's the one that I could find online, the earliest one that I could find. That's what I wanted to do, was find an early edition. From what I understand, the seventh edition, which is the current one, makes quite a few changes to the game. You know, it's still the BRP system, but it does things differently. The first six, I believe, are much more closely related to each other mechanics wise. And so I wanted to talk about those earlier ones. Okay, so the core system of Call of Cthulhu, it's a percentile system. It's a D100 system. It's skill based, and it's going to prioritize realism over heroics. Okay, so that's the short version. All right, but let's get into it. Start looking at our game here. So you see here, it is the third edition. It is the hardback volume, as it says. And in our table of contents, it's broken up into what I think were the original, like in the box set, the books were broken up to the Investigator's book. And Investigators are what you call player characters in this game. And then the Keeper's book. And then it's got a source book for the 1920s, and then the Cthulhu Companion and the appendices and color plates. All right. Oh, I should point out Sandy Peterson, the author of this game. So I mentioned some other projects that he worked on with Chaosium. Well, in addition to all those, he is going to get very involved. He works on the Ghostbusters role-playing game for West End Games, which we briefly mentioned that in the introduction. And then he's also going to work in the video game industry. So if you know the game Doom, that's Sandy Peterson. He worked on that. So he's very much into this very horror-like genre. All right, so let's talk about, you know, there's a foreword here, and you've got like the introduction and the purpose of the game. I'm not going to go through that, like how to read the dice. It does tell you that you should read very heavily from H.P. Lovecraft, and then it lists specific stories here that it says are a good place to start because they're the ones that are most relevant to the Cthulhu mythos. So you see that over here on the left-hand side. And but now let's get into creating the investigator, how to create a player character. So player characters in the game, you know, again, they're investigators. They're not heroes. They're not, you know, that kind of thing. They're fragile. They're sort of curious humans who are probably not going to be prepared for what's coming in the game. And you want to lean into that. That's part of the fun of this game, is playing those types of characters. Now, standard BRP system has 7 characteristics: size, strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, power, and appearance. So we're going to have those same characteristics in Call of Cthulhu, but you're also going to add education and sanity. Okay, so those are kind of important. Sanity, very, very specifically, is going to be very important. It's very specific to Call of Cthulhu. We're going to have a whole section here in the video where we're going to talk about the sanity mechanic. And sanity is derived from your power, and your power is like your sort of your mental acumen, and it's not like willpower necessarily, but it's kind of related to that. Okay, so the characteristics are mostly, interestingly enough, most of them are going to be determined by rolling 3d6, although some of them are going to be determined, like size and intelligence, by rolling 2d6 and adding 6. Education's determined rolling 3d6 and adding 3. Again, I'm not here to teach you how to play the game. I'm just kind of giving you a quick snapshot of like how some things are similar but also different from Dungeons and Dragons. Now, you're going to have your derived characteristics like your hit points, your damage bonus, and your movement that are going to come from your ability scores. Now, what's interesting is that in Call of Cthulhu, you start out with a certain amount of hit points and you never are going to get any more during the course of, like, as you gain experience, which means your skills get better, you don't gain hit points. And that's trying to keep that realism down, that a human being shot with a gun doesn't really matter how experienced they are. It can kill them. Right. And so you're not able to shrug things off just as you go up in experience in Call of Cthulhu, which I think is really interesting. So the way that you're going to define your character is through these different occupations. And so you see the list over here on the left-hand side. You've got author, journalist, dilettante, doctor, lawyer, professor, historian/antiquarian, parapsychologist, and private eye. So those are kind of the occupations that you can be. And then under them, it lists the skills that are available for those occupation types. And so that's going to be very important, because the choice of occupation then is going to determine what you're good at doing in the game. So an author is good at, like, history and psychology and oratory, whereas a historian is good at bargaining, also history, but making maps. But the parapsychologist is good at things like psychoanalysis and psychology and the occult. And, a lot of the skills you can see here overlap. History keeps coming up quite often, but the lawyer's not good at history. The lawyer's good at fast talking debate and has a better credit rating than other people. Dilettantes can choose any 5 skills that they want at will, as an example. So that's how these are all different. But these occupations are not just flavor text. They're providing the motivation for why a character is going to go on to an adventure on a case. So a journalist might be following a story that they were working on, like some, a bizarre, crazy story that they uncovered. While a professor might be researching some forbidden archaeology, or a private eye might be stumbling onto something, like while on a case. They might come across something unnatural while working on a case. And so the occupations then help provide hooks for the keeper, which is their term for the dungeon master, the game master in Call of Cthulhu. It provides the hooks for the keeper to kind of figure out how to integrate people into the story and into the game. Okay. So you're going to get your skill points, which are going to be determined by your education, and your education score. And that's what you put into your occupational skills. And then your intelligence is going to help you determine how many other skills you can pick on top of that. So you get your occupational skills, but then you also get to pick some other skills from any of the lists that you want, anything that you want to focus on. And that helps provide a little bit of diversity and gives you sort of this combination of professional competence, but then individual quirks. And so the different skill lists that you can pull from are based on, like, their academic, investigative, and social. There's physical and stealth. There's technical and medical. And then there's combat. So combat Call of Cthulhu is skill-based, and it's kind of wrapped into the skill system. And so here you're going to see all the different types of skills it talks about here. So you see the combat skills: fighting, there's impaling, using melee weapons, and using firearms. So all of those are skills that you would have as that you can pick from. Okay. So what's really interesting here is that, again, the characters are going to evolve naturally, and it's going to be based on sort of the immersive role play and sort of natural growth for the characters, versus like grinding for XP like you do in Dungeons and Dragons. So the way that skills improve in Call of Cthulhu is by using them. And so that is what you get good at. They get good through the use of those skills, as opposed to, like, gaining experience from killing monsters, right? Because that's not relevant to Call of Cthulhu. So what's interesting also is that if you saw that list of the different occupations, let's look at that again over here on the left-hand side, you notice that these aren't built for, like, combat and violence. They're built for inquiry and analysis and survival. All right. So like the doctor is going to help people out with surviving. But these aren't, like, you don't see, like, soldiers on here or anything like that, like, because that's not what this game is about. And so having that list, and I always say this, like, these aren't character classes. because this is not a class-based system, but just having these list of occupations tells you something about the world. The fact that a player character isn't going to play someone in the army who's out there, shooting up monsters. That's telling you, it's giving you the tone of the game right from the very start. And D&D can do the same thing with the class list. I know the class list has kind of ballooned over the years in new editions, but as a DM, if you limit the classes in the game, that tells you something about the world. Or like we've talked about before, like in some of the different settings, like say Dark Sun, as I talked about in Dungeons and Dragons, the class list in Dark Sun is a completely different list than the classes that are normally available in a second edition D&D game. And that tells you something about how that world operates. And I think a lot of people don't always understand that when they look at the list of classes. They look at it as like, what are the goodies that I get? What are the abilities and what I'm going to be good at doing, as opposed to thinking, how does this fit into the world? All right, now I talked about the combat kind of being based on skills, and it uses the exact same percentile mechanic. So the percentile system is that you have a percentage rating in a skill, and when you are doing something, you want to roll that or lower on percentile dice. That's the quick and dirty version. I mean, there's different, there's modifiers and there's all that kind of stuff like any game, right? But that's the essence of it. It's very gritty. It's very deadly. And in this game, you've got that ability score called sanity that we talked about. And again, we're going to talk about that in more in depth in just a second here. But losing your sanity is actually a worse fate than losing hit points. And the game is more focused on tracking that. It's often more important than your hit points, right? Even though hit points are very, very low. And so knowing that, again, the system is evoking the theme of the game. Knowing that your hit points are low, that means violence is usually not the option that you want to take. You want to avoid it at almost all costs, because one hit from a gun, if the dice roll well, can kill you. And now first level D&D characters, at least in the old school versions of the game, could also die from one hit. But in Call of Cthulhu, you could be playing for months with the same character, and because your hit points never go up, you could still die from one hit. So that means you're trying to avoid being hit. All right. So that's kind of the skill system. You see all the skills here, and it's just going to list, how they work in the game and what you can do with them. Standard skill system has a pronunciation guide for Cthulhuoid names, which is helpful. And now here's sanity. Now, I'm going to come back to this in a second because I want to spend a little bit more time on it, but I'm going to skip past this for now and go to some other parts of the book. So I'll get to sanity kind of toward the end of the section here. But we're going to get into the Keeper's book now. So this is like, essentially your DM's guide in D&D terms. And the first thing it's going to do is launch into the Cthulhu mythos, which is really fun. So this is a great section, very, very flavorful. For Cthulhu monsters. And one of the things that I like is these descriptions, because a lot of times it's going to pull from, actual text from H.P. Lovecraft and the other kind of Lovecraft or Cthulhu authors. Okay, so for example, the deep ones here over on the left-hand side, this is a lesser servitor race. And for the description, instead of just saying like, okay, so if you look at Father Dagon and Mother Hydra, the description says, these are slimy, deep ones that have grown enormously in size and age. Father Dagon and Mother Hydra are each over 20 feet tall. That's the description, very, to the point. But you look at the description for the deep ones, and it says, I think their predominant color was a grayish green, though they had white bellies. They were mostly shiny and slippery, but the ridges of their backs were scaly. Their forms vaguely suggested the anthropoid, while their heads were the heads of fish, with prodigious bulging eyes that never closed. At the sides of their necks were palpitating gills, and their long paws were webbed. They hopped irregularly, sometimes on 2 legs and sometimes on 4. Their croaking, baying voices held all of the dark shades of expression which their staring faces lacked. They were the blasphemous fish frogs of the nameless design, living and horrible. Sorry, I read that so poorly. It's very hard to read on my screen here. I should have increased the size. I don't have the world's best eyesight, unfortunately. But anyway, that's from The Shadows over Innsmouth from H.P. Lovecraft. So, and it's very evocative text, and that's why a lot of people love H.P. Lovecraft. Is this very these descriptions and things like this? It really kind of sets the mood. Okay, but these are creatures that you could use if you've got the 1981 or 1980, Deities and Demigods from Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, the one with the Cthulhu mythos in it and the Melnibonéan mythos. So that'll be the first or second printings of those of that. They have Cthulhu monsters in there, but these descriptions in here are so much more flavorful than the ones you get in the Deities and Demigods book. Okay, so it's going to go through all of those. It's got some cool drawings here, very cool. And so we're going to go through that, and then we're going to get to magic and spells. So I wanted to talk about this a little bit because magic, there is magic in Call of Cthulhu. It works very, very differently, and it has a different, again, flavor and tone than the magic that you get in a Dungeons and Dragons game. Especially in modern Dungeons and Dragons, where it seems like every class now can cast spells, and magic sort of is so ubiquitous that it's, pardon the pun, but it's no longer magical. It doesn't have that mystery behind it. It's just a tool that you use. And especially when you have cities with like continual light lamps and magic shops where you can just walk in and buy any magic item. Like, to me, that kind of removes a lot of the specialness and the fun and mystery, like I said, of magic. Well, Call of Cthulhu has that in spades. So magic in Call of Cthulhu is all about forbidden knowledge, costly rituals. It's about summoning, and it's the mythos as a corrupting force. Magic isn't something that you take lightly, and it's not something that you'd be like, oh, it's dark in here, I'm going to cast a light spell. It's because every time you use magic, there's a cost, and that cost is your sanity, right? And you don't want that to happen. So it's very different. There's very few offensive spells in Call of Cthulhu. Most magic, it's ritualistic in nature. It's very slow, and it involves summoning or controlling these horrific entities. And I love that. I think it's very, very cool. So spells are mostly going to be learned from ancient tomes, and it talks here, the books of the Cthulhu mythos. You see that here. And they are major sources of magical power and lore. And they help increase your Cthulhu mythos skill, which is not always a good thing. You don't always want your skill to go up because that's going to happen at the cost of your sanity. And all these different books are going to tell you how much sanity you're going to lose when you use that book. So you see that on the table here on the left-hand side, the very last column on the right, the effect on SAN. And again, we haven't talked about SAN, how it works, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So reading a book takes months to study. And then you have to make a skill roll in the book's language to see if you even understand it. And your sanity loss, though, is automatic upon first reading it. And then subsequent attempts, as you use the book over and over again, they have the amount of sanity that you're going to lose, but it's still going to affect you. So you can see here the very top book, like say the Necronomicon, which is the second book listed, that's going to cause you to lose 2d10 off of your sanity. So that's pretty crazy. So the Knowledge Plus is going to boost your Cthulhu Mythos skills, but it's also used for fact finding. And then your spell multiplier, it determines the chance to learn the spells from the book. Okay, so, and then there's all these different editions and translations and stuff, and later editions and translations might give different benefits, right? So you can see here the language. Some of the books have multiples written down there. Okay, so, but there's other sources of learning magic. There's diaries, which you can gain knowledge and maybe a few spells. There's grimoires, which are high-level spell multipliers, but low knowledge gain. So there's this like kind of back and forth of like, what is it that you're trying to get out of using magic? Now, different magic spells kind of are kind of divided into three types. There's summoning, there's binding, and there's contacting. Those are kind of the main ones. So you're learning your spells mainly from reading books, but you can also learn them one-on-one from a teacher, or you can learn them from a deity or a monster, which is a lot of times why you want to contact one of these monsters. Monsters in quotes, okay? And you have magic points that are equal to your power, and that's what you use to cast spells. And then they regenerate, like every few hours. All right. And so again, we talked about this spell types. So summoning spells are going to summon specific beings. And there's a list here. So it's not like, you get to pick what you summon. It's like you see, it's telling you very specifically, summon Byakhi, summon Dark One or Shub Nagurath, summon the Dimensional Shambler. They're very, very specific. And then you have binding spells, which are the binding version of those summon spells. So once you've summoned it, you want to bind it into your service. Okay. So now summoning spells require materials, sacrifices, timing, and of course the requisite sanity loss. And binding spells, when you do that, you can only really give it one command, and it's going to cost your sanity every time per attempt that you do that. Contacting spells are contacting usually lesser races or deities, and you're doing that to gain knowledge or skills, or like I said, magic. They can teach you spells. So you might contact somebody, and sometimes the contact spells are reaching people from, out in the void, and you're talking to them to have them teach you. Sometimes certain things like ghouls or deep ones might actually be on the earth. And so when you contact them, they're going to come to you. So you kind of just need to be aware of that. Then there's spells for calling deities. And that is a whole kind of other thing, but you would do that kind of again to gain knowledge or skills, and there's special requirements for specific deities and things like that. So that's the short version of the magic system. Like I said, it's very, very flavorful. There's other spells that you can do. There's brewing space mead. There is like resurrection. There's creating gates, all that kind of stuff. Very, very specific spells. It's a short list of spells, which I also like. It's not pages and pages because, again, magic is not supposed to be something that is, again, ubiquitous in a Call of Cthulhu game. It's supposed to be limited, and it's supposed to be powerful in a way, but also scary, and you maybe don't want to use it, right? So there's just more here on the different spells that you have. There's the complete list over here on the right-hand side. So again, you can see it's not very long. All right, so that's the magic system. So magic is dangerous, it's costly, and it often has, again, permanent consequences to your sanity, to your power, and it is presented as a corrupting temptation. And again, I really like that aspect of it. That's how I kind of see magic even in the D&D game that I run for my daughter and her friends. They don't run into a lot of magic users, and when they do, it kind of sticks out because, again, I don't use them all the time. Now, two of the girls in my game, as you know, are elves, and elves in basic D&D also cast spells, but they're taught by someone who controls the spells that they learn. So they're not running around blasting people with magic missiles and fireballs and stuff like that. It's a very different kind of game that I run for them. But most spells in Call of Cthulhu, they're specific in their use, in their location, or their time. Sometimes it's like a one spell, rarely can substitute for another spell. Like in D&D, if you run out of fireball, you can cast lightning bolt or something like that. You don't have that in Call of Cthulhu. You're using it for a very specific purpose, and you need to know that particular spell. And the keeper in Call of Cthulhu is very, very critical for the implementation of using these spells, the ingredient selections and the consequences. And essentially, when you are casting magic in Call of Cthulhu, it's kind of like you are trading your humanity for knowledge. And that is a key theme to the tone of a Call of Cthulhu game. All right, so that's the magic system. Now I'm going to go back to sanity, back here on page 29. I guess I could have done it earlier, but I kind of wanted to get through some of the other stuff first. So sanity, I think, is really kind of the hallmark of Call of Cthulhu as the game. The sanity mechanic. It was groundbreaking. It was the first game to have a mechanic like this, and it has become one of the most influential innovations in role-playing game history. I would say if Call of Cthulhu has a legacy beyond just the game itself, I would say it's the introduction of this sanity mechanic. And again, this push towards these more story-based types of things where it's not about rolling dice and resource management and that wargaming aspect. It's more about like the effect the game has on your character because of the things that they're learning and that they weren't meant to have learned. Okay, so your sanity is going to start out. You're going to have a number of points equal to your power attribute that you rolled earlier at the start of the game. And then when you're confronted with something horrifying like a corpse or an eldritch creature or a forbidden knowledge or item or anything like that, you have to make a sanity roll. And again, it's a percentile system, so you're trying to roll under your SAN. And if you fail, it's going to cost you a portion of those sanity points. Now, if the loss is minor, it might cause things like shaking hands or a little bit of paranoia or things like that. If the loss is major, the keeper might impose like temporary or indefinite or permanent insanity, like losing those points. So this creates like this kind of escalating tension in the game, because even if your investigator lives through a scenario, they might lose their grip on reality. And that reflects kind of the core theme of Lovecraft's writings, which is that knowledge itself is dangerous. So you can see here how detailed they get into the insanity and the sanity mechanic here. So you have, again, you've got shock and temporary loss. You've got indefinite. You've got the value of insanity, and then how to regain, and also how to increase your sanity during the game. So it talks about defeating monsters and psychoanalysis, which is a way that you can cure your insanity, and or institutionalization. So it gets a little, I don't want to say close to home, but like, there's some people that aren't comfortable with these kind of topics, and that's fine. But then Call of Cthulhu might not be the game for them, because this does deal a lot with this idea of like you're losing your hold on reality because of the things that you're seeing. And I know there's a lot of people who play Call of Cthulhu with the idea that your character's either going to die or go insane, and those are the only two choices that are going to happen. I've played Call of Cthulhu before, not too much with the original Chaosium systems. We did, but the guy who was running the game was kind of he grew up playing the system, and I did not play this back in the day. So, but he was never really comfortable with the system. He didn't think it was a great system. And so we tried it a little bit, and then we moved to the D20 version of Call of Cthulhu, which didn't work for us at all. And eventually we settled on a Savage Worlds hack. I think it's called Realms of Cthulhu. And that's the one that he feels comfortable running. It's a very pulpy adventure type thing. And there is a supplement for Call of Cthulhu called Pulp Cthulhu, I think. And that kind of gives you more tools for running kind of like an Indiana Jones style pulp adventure, where your adventures are maybe a little bit more physically capable, and you probably are going to get into some more like melee and fisticuffs and things like that than you would in a traditional game. So that's the style that he likes to play, which is why Savage Worlds works for that. But again, in this original system, I think that it's a little bit less like that, and it is more like your characters are probably going to have some issues along the way. Whereas in the Savage Worlds version we played Massive Nyarlathotep and a few others as well, but he kind of strung them into one long campaign. We played that for like 13 years of real time, and I started it in with the same character, and there were some lucky die rolls in there, but my sanity was pretty intact pretty much the whole time. So anyway, so that's the sanity. And so we talked about this Keeper's Book and the magic system, and then you get into this section on like how to play the game, and this is going to have a lot of like sort of ready-made scenarios that you see in here. So you've got a source book for the 1920s, which is really fun as well. You've got the Hindenburg airship and a map there. You've got railway coaches and how they're laid out, which is really fun. I'm a big train fan. You've got the timeline for the 1920s. You have biographies of different people, and that goes on for a ways. You've got different companies and crime and history and bribery, cultists. You have other occupations here. So it says listed here are alternate occupations which investigators and keepers may wish to try. Other occupations not listed can be easily extrapolated by comparing them to those listed below and those given in the source book. So some other occupations would be anarchist, gangster, missionary, professional athlete, hobo, politician, soldier, policeman, and farmer. So this is where you finally see the soldier here. And this is going to change the tone of the game if you start adding these, because now you're getting into a little bit of things where, the soldier's really not going to offer much in terms of helping investigate. They're really just there for muscle. And then that's telling you that like, okay, then you expect to get into combat. So, like I said, the occupations are going to determine the tone of the game. You've got nautical skills, you've got sages, travel, you've got sample distances, you've got prices for different things and different weapons, a list of weapons, black market, you've got beasts and encounters, all this kind of stuff. So all that's pretty cool, pretty standard. You've got a bibliography here, which is really helpful. And then you've got your Cthulhu Companion, and it talks about like the mythos in the Mesoamerican region. And it talks about further notes on the Necronomicon. This is just like little details that are kind of fun to add flavor text for the most part. And you've got your source book editions. You've got some new skills here, photography and lock picking. and new phobias. So that is related to your sanity, right? So when I do sanity in my game, I call it composure. In the game I run for my daughter and her friends, and it is roughly a little bit based on the sanity system from Call of Cthulhu, but involving some other things, including an early system that Professor Dungeon Master came up with on Dungeon Craft, and I kind of mixed a bunch of things together and created my own homebrew system. But in my game, when something happens, I don't roll on the table to determine what happens to the characters. Like, they're rolling to see if they're going to lose composure. But if they do, then I ask them, tell me how this impacted your character. And it's relevant to the situation that caused them to lose their composure in the first place. So then they get to narrate to me what happens to their character. And I like that a lot better for me. And it also gets them more involved versus just rolling on a table and saying like, oh, I ran away, which is not really super fun, right? So these are more different additional Cthulhu type monsters and creatures like that. So you've got ghasts and different types of new monsters. Excerpts and prayers, the paper chase. So this is another adventure scenario that's in here. A few more of these. So that's kind of the end of the book here. And then you're going to get into some cool art here in just a second. Your sanity quiz. So this is great. This is a list of words that you can use to when you're narrating a game as the keeper to kind of evoke the flavor and the atmosphere that you want. So you can see here on these 2 pages, there's tons of words in here. Aberrant and abominable, depraved, deranged, slimy, slithering, sluggish, unutterable, vaporous. So as DMs, as game masters, we probably get into a rut of using the same words all the time. I know I do. So when I write my adventures, I specifically will put words on there that I want to use, like one to describe a room or an encounter, so that I don't just keep repeating myself all the time. Well, this is a great list here to use. I went through a phase a while back where I was posting like this. It was usually around 16 to 20 words from all the authors of the Appendix N from Dungeons and Dragons, like evocative, descriptive words that you could use. But this is a whole list of very Lovecraftian Cthulhu type of words, which is super helpful. And then after your appendices, you've got your character sheet there. So here's the art. So you've got some really fun art in here. And I love the car. I just love the 1920s, time period for these stories taking place. I think it's a really fun period time to look. 1920s, 1930s, whatever. Some really creepy stuff here, like this guy over on the right coming in through the window is pretty creepy. So really great art. Okay, but the tone of the game, it's very much cosmic horror. It's about helplessness and futility, really. And, those could be some pretty heavy themes. So you have to have the right group for this, I think. And we played it, like I said, for 13 years of total time, but we did take breaks in between to play some standard fantasy, to play some Star Trek RPG, like, little palate cleansers. And then we would come back and do this. It wasn't like it was ongoing, but total time, it ended up being 13 years. So, but your investigators are sort of they're built as a person, not as a hero. And it's a big distinction. It's a big difference. Your expertise is going to define who they were before they were exposed to the horror, and their survival depends more on careful planning and having a steady mind versus absorbing damage with your hit points or killing your monsters, your opponents. So when you're running a Call of Cthulhu game, you want to prioritize the mood and suspense and the horror over random encounters. And you want to gradually introduce greater threats. It's like an onion. You're not peeling an onion, and every new layer you get to is a worse and worse threat. So you start with minor things like cults, minor horrors, and then you're going to get to, over time, the elder gods and beings like that. But it's a slow progression. And one of the things that I think is very important in a Call of Cthulhu game is preserving the player agency. So modifying your scenarios to adapt to the player actions and their creativity. Because one of the things in Call of Cthulhu, I think that even more so than in like a D&D game, where a lot of times in a D&D game, you're looking at your character sheet to see what feats or skills, if you're playing modern D&D, you can use. Call of Cthulhu plays much more like an early version of D&D that didn't have all those extra goodies. So it's more about your player skill. How can you outthink this scenario and get past it so your character doesn't die? So, the legacy of Call of Cthulhu, again, is it defined horror RPGs. It was the first horror role-playing game, and it created that sanity trope that we talked about, and it's inspired a generation of investigative systems that came after, whether they're Cthulhu-based or not. It was one of the first games that prioritized investigation versus combat, okay? And one of the things I think is super cool is, again, it is still published by the same company that published it 45 years ago for the first time. It's one of the few games that's still around that's still being published by its original publisher. And I think that's amazing. So what are some things that you can take from this and adapt to a D&D game or an OSR game or anything like that? Well, obviously the sanity, I think, is definitely for sure. You can use that. You'd have to adapt it a little bit. Again, I've done that in my games. If anybody wants to see how I do it, let me know. Send me an email. And it's samothDM@gmail.com. So DM @gmail.com. And I can send you a copy of how I use sanity in my games. But I think that's something that you could definitely use in a game if you want that. I don't always like the results that come out of it, especially when it's something like, oh, you flee. Because then that character's out of the game. That player has to just sit there where everybody else is doing stuff. And that's not really always fun. So I think having other results are a better way of handling it. But, it's just something that you have to get used to. Having magic being a corrupting temptation and losing something when you use magic. So maybe using magic actually causes you to lose experience points or maybe not gain as many experience points. And that's kind of the impact of like, oh, you use this horrible thing in order to get out of the situation. And so as a consequence, you're not going to gain as much. Now, a lot of people say that's too heavy-handed. Sure. So come up with something else to kind of make it so that magic has a cost. And then that defines the tone of that game and how magic is used. The investigative aspects of the game, like you can prioritize investigation in D&D, by the way, as a DM that you run the game, but also having players that have skills or whatever it is to conduct investigations and get better at it. It doesn't have to be skills. It can just be knowing that like that's what they're going to prioritize during the game. So using like those clue chains, those layered mysteries to kind of change the tone of your game. And then another thing that Call of Cthulhu is really, really, really big on, and was one of the first games to do this, is props. So tons of handout props in the game. And it was, like I said, one of the first to really do this in a really fun and exciting way, where the adventures came a lot of times boxed with all these extra goodies that you would hand out to people. And it really kind of helps immerse you into the world. So I can tell you, for the example that I had playing is, again, through that massive Nyarlathotep, which is like one of the, I think, most famous Call of Cthulhu adventures. So originally written for the original system. Again, we adapted it for the kind of Savage Worlds system that we were using. But the DM, I think there was a lot of props, not the DM, the keeper. There were a lot of props from the original one, but then he went like full bore, and there are people who like sell physical props that you can buy. And so he bought a lot of those, but then he created a lot of them too. So using just his printer and Google Images and things like that, he bought newsprint paper that fed into his ink dot printer and inkjet printer. And he printed out newspapers for us using newspaper style fonts, black and white photos, and he would create, and then he grabbed old articles from newspapers that actually existed, that like really happened, and then he would insert news stories that were relevant to our story. So it really kind of immersed us, because we were reading about things that we knew had actually happened in the real world alongside things that were happening in our game for our adventures. And he printed it out on newspaper, so you were touching it and it felt like you were reading a newspaper. He printed out postcards, and then he would write and look like it had been mailed and things like that, but the pictures were coming from online, but he was printing it on like heavy cardstock. He made matchbooks for different clubs that we went to that had logos on them. I mean, he went full bore. But again, it really kind of helped to get you into the world, and I loved it. I thought it was super cool, and that's something that you can easily do, and then again adapt it to D&D. I think it's a lot easier to do in a sort of modern era game, because again, you can use those images that you find online to create things that actually exist. Like example, photographs or postcards or newspapers or that kind of thing. But you can take that inspiration and use it in a fantasy game for sure. And having real props, I've handed out scrolls to my players that I've printed out and kind of, I soak them in coffee or tea to make it look old and aged. And then, you can burn the edges. There's all kinds of things you can find online for tips on how to do that. But it really kind of helps bring them into the game. And so I think that's something that you can definitely do. So I know this was long for Call of Cthulhu. I told you it was going to be the longest one that we looked at. But next up, we're going to talk about Chill and sort of being like the second major horror-based role-playing game. And really quickly, I did want to point out that if you are looking for ways to support Daddy Roll the One, I do have a Patreon now that a lot of folks had asked for me to set up. They've been asking actually for quite a while, and I finally got it set up last month in September. And you can join at patreon.com/Daddy Roll the One. And I provide pretty much weekly content. I'm providing random tables and class concepts and sneak peeks behind the scenes of projects that I'm working on. I have some behind the scenes videos of my artist and designer friend that helped me with my first adventure that I released on my Patreon called The Bone Mill. I'll chat about that in just a second. And I do exclusive polls for my patrons to ask them about upcoming videos. I ask questions on things that you guys would like to see and all of that. And I'm going to be very, very close to setting up a Discord. One of my viewers and patrons has offered to kind of help me with that because I don't use Discord myself, but I will get more involved. But I'll be setting that up soon. So there will be an exclusive Daddy Roll the One Discord. You can get all that for $5 a month. So as an example, the kind of content you're going to get, this is an exclusive adventure that you can only get at my Patreon. This is called The Bone Mill, thematically appropriate here for the Halloween time period. And I redesigned it as like this kind of folder. So I printed it out on this heavy cardstock paper and like large size paper, but the illustration is done by my friend Bill Green, as you can see here, and as well as the maps and then all the layout. And then I did the writing. And so I would like to point out that Bill is available if anyone's looking to publish their own role-playing game supplement or product and needs maps or art or layout. Bill is available. And I particularly like this little logo that he made here, made with human intelligence. He drew this 5-fingered hand to kind of show that like it's not an AI hand with multiple fingers. But one of my viewers pointed out, or patrons pointed out, that you can use this as like a folder to come to your event or to your game and put your character sheets or notes and stuff inside. And then, of course, you could set it up like this if you wanted to use it as a DM folder. And so that's the Bone Mill. I'll be releasing another adventure later this month in October about the famous Scolomonts or Black Skull from Romanian folklore. So be on the lookout for that. And thanks for all your support from my patrons. Okay, I thought it'd be fun to do a quick interlude and look at the history of the D20, the 20-sided die that's so ubiquitous in gaming cultures, especially Dungeons and Dragons. And they've been around for thousands of years. The earliest ones made from either glass or stone or bone. And the oldest one in existence that we are aware of at this point is in the Museum of Metropolitan Art in New York. And that is the serpentine icosahedron. It comes from the Ptolemaic era period of Egypt, found near Alexandria, and it's thought to date to around 200 BC. And it's inscribed with Greek letters. People think it was used either for games of chance or for divination, or most likely it was used for both. But the die is going to be continually found in that area. So there's another one from about the 1st century AD. It's called the Dakhla die. It's the Dakhla Oasis where it was found. And this one, instead of just having letters or numbers on it, is inscribed with the names of 20 different Egyptian gods. So that one probably, again, used for divination purposes, but there's ones found in ancient Greece. There's ones found in 2nd century Roman die, 2nd century AD. So kind of moving throughout that Mediterranean geography. But we also see it as far away as places like India. So in the 1700s, late 1700s, the Tipu Sultan, who passed away in 1799, well, one of his treasures that he had was a 20-sided golden puzzle box. Now, it's pretty big. It's about as big as your hand, or about as big as my little dice box here. And it's inscribed with all different numbers, but they're not in order. And so it's thought to have been used maybe as like to solve mathematical problems, or maybe just kind of contemplating different mathematical equations, or it could just be like a puzzle box. But I think that's really interesting. Now, in the United States, the first patent that we see for a 20-sided die, I think, comes from 1925. And this is a 20-sided die with letters. And the letters are in different amounts. So there's a lot of M's. I think M has the most, but they also have A, K, E, and J. And then two of the sides are inscribed with the phrase Honest Abe. So that's 1925. But the United States is going to have various periods of time where the 20-sided die is going to be patented either singularly by itself or with other dice for different purposes, like lottery games or poker games. There's a game where it's the D8 and the D20. But it's continuously going to be popping up. In the 1950s and 1960s, we see a 20-sided die from the Japanese Standards Association, and they put three of them in a little plastic case. And these were used for mathematical precision measurement. I'm not exactly sure how that was used, but I think that was kind of interesting. Now, in 1963, we're going to see a patent in the United States for a dice game with tetrahedron dice. And that this is going to be the first time, I believe, that we're going to see all 5 polyhedral die, platonic solids 4, 6, 8, 12, and 20 in one game. And it came in a little baggie. And I think that that's really kind of cool because that's going to start to become a standard that gamers are going to start to see. So in 1971, the game Tractix is published, the war game, by Guidon Games. And one of the illustrators that worked on that, Don Lowry, is going to eventually start helping to print that game, future printings, including a D20. So I don't believe the original box set from 1971 included a D20, but later printings are going to. And of course, you know, Guidon Games as being the publisher of Chainmail. So as Don Lowry discovered these D20s, which most people think came from the Creative Publications catalog of dice, they were selling dice for educational purposes, for teaching math classes and things like that. So, obviously Gary Gygax would have been exposed to that as well because they were all looking at these things and working on these games together. So the various patents have been used over time, like I said, in the United States for quote unquote improvements to the D20. I think the most famous one is probably from 1999. And that's the one that I had my designer friend, Bill Green, recreate, faithfully reproduce from scratch. He had to hand draw it because the original one is just not high res. And so he traced over it and filled in the gaps and created this patent design. It's a very clean high res version that you can only get at my shop. He also did the same thing for all the other dice patents, the 4, the 8, the 12, and for that dice game with tetrahedron die from 1963. And you can find all of those at my shop on t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, tote bags, or if you prefer, you can get it on a sticker, poster, or a notebook. And so here's some of my D20s. I just thought it would be kind of fun to look at. So I have this giant, heavy metal one. You can just hear the sound that makes. This is my very first D20 that came in my Moldvay Basic box set. And you'll see from 1981, you'll see I never inked in or crayoned in the numbers. I've talked about that here on the channel before. This is the one that came with my set from Gamma World, my Gamma World box set. And then this is just a fun version of a D20. It's called the Fate Mill. And this is from Tower House Creative. I've talked about that here on the channel. So that's a look at the D20. And thanks for your support. Cheers. Okay, so now let's continue our discussion of these horror role-playing games, these early tabletop horror role-playing games with Chill. So after Call of Cthulhu, of the early role-playing games dedicated to horror, this is probably the second best known. Very different in tone, as you're going to see here in a second. Actually, you can tell right here on the cover, it says it's a frightfully fun role-playing game. So this is created by Pace Setter. So who's Pace Setter? Well, very interesting kind of way that Pace Setter came about. So in the early 80s, 1983 to 1984, very specifically, TSR, which was, again, if you're new to studying this, TSR was the company that published Dungeons & Dragons at the time. And they were undergoing a lot of financial issues, and there were a ton of layoffs. So between layoffs and just people leaving, they lost like 200 people. So that just shows you how big the company was. And there were a lot of former employees that were upset, and they went on to kind of go on to form their own game companies. And one of them was Pace Setter, which was almost, not exactly quite all, but almost all staffed by former TSR employees and staffers. So they created Pace Setter in January of 1984, and then they immediately went on the offensive. They published 3 role-playing games in that first year, like get them created, printed, distributed, all that kind of stuff in a single year, 3 role-playing games. We'll talk about them in a second here. But founded by, a few different people from TSR. So Gail Sanchez, and I unfortunately couldn't find a lot about Gail, but Gary, I'm going to say Spiegel. It might be Spiegel. So apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. But while at TSR, Gary worked on Dragonlance, worked on CM2, the module CM2, which is for the companion set of Beckney D&D called Death's Ride. And he worked on a Gamma World module called The Cleansing War of Garrick Blackhand, just as examples, right? So he's going to come over to Pacesetter, as is Mark Akers. So that name hopefully sounds familiar to you because I just talked about him on my video looking at some of TSR's other role-playing games that we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about. I did 3 of them, or no, 4. Nope, I'm going to correct myself again, 5. I did Dawn Patrol, I did the Indiana Jones role-playing game, the Conan role-playing game, the Buck Rogers role-playing game, all produced by TSR. And then the 5th one that I talked about was Gangbusters. Well, Gangbusters was co-created by Mark Akers. So, and Mark actually dropped into the comments on that video to offer comments on that and correct a couple things that I had gotten incorrect, which is super awesome. So I've mentioned before, if you want to see like former TSR creators and writers and artists and all that kind of stuff and hear their stuff, a lot of times they come into the comments and talk about things. So John Pickens just did it recently on my video on Demons and Devils. And again, if you've watched the channel enough, hopefully you know who John Pickens is by now, because I do mention him frequently. But Mark Akers also worked on the Marvel Superheroes role-playing game while he was at TSR before he left, just as an example. Troy Denning is going to be a founder of Pacesetter. Well, he's going to go on to be not just go on. He's a very famous role-playing game designer, but I would say probably most well-known for creating the Dark Sun setting, one of the creators of the Dark Sun setting. Okay, there was Andrea Hayday, who worked on Dragon Strike and Al-Qadim and Spelljammer and Ravenloft. There's John Ricketts at Pacesetter, who's going to be the CEO. He's also going to be the last employee of the company because it's only going to be in business for 2 years, unfortunately. So at the very end, the story I read was like he was the last person left after everyone else, and he was there basically just to fulfill orders for people that had already ordered stuff, but at that point they were shutting down. But you have Stephen D. Sullivan. We've talked about Stephen before here on the channel as well. Worked on Scourge of the Slave Lords, Castle Amber, the Arms and Equipment Guide for D&D. And you have Michael Williams, who was a novelist at TSR and wrote like 5 different Dragonlance novels. So a lot of these people are going to come over. Well, these are the people that come over from TSR to help create Pacesetter. So Chill is going to be one of the first 3 role-playing games that they're going to publish. They're also going to publish a science fiction role-playing game and called Star Ace, and they're going to publish a sort of interdimensional game, time travel game called Time Masters. So all 3 of those in the first year. And if you notice something about that, you'll notice that none of them is a traditional standard fantasy role-playing game. So one of the reasons I think is because they just didn't want to compete in that arena. That there were a lot of them, but Dungeons & Dragons is sort of like the one to beat. And if you don't really have anything new that you're bringing to the table, there's sort of really no point. But these other genres, especially like time travel, was not really a thing. I think there was only one other game out there at the time. It was very small distribution for that game. So Time Masters has a built-in one. And then even with the science fiction games, there were a couple. By this point, Star Frontiers was out there, of course, Star Trek, and then Traveler being, I believe, the first or one of the first science fiction role-playing games. There are a few other smaller ones that I have talked about them here on the channel before, but these were places where they could kind of compete. Well, horror was a big one as well, because at this point, really Call of Cthulhu kind of was the first, but it'd only been out for a few years. And I think there was only 1 or 2 others. One of them we're going to talk about here in a minute. So there was no competition in the horror arena. And they were inspired sort of by, and were trying to capture the feeling of creating the feeling of like the 20th century, sort of mid 20th century horror films, like especially like the Hammer horror films and the Universal monster films. And so the gist of the game is that player characters are called envoys. And like in Call of Cthulhu, they're called investigators, and Chill, they're called envoys. And they work for this organization called SAVE, S-A-V-E. And it originally stands for the Societas Albae Viae Eternitata. My Latin's horrible. You guys all know that by now. But that stands for the Eternal Society of the White Way. Now, later editions of Chill, they're going to change that. Instead of the white way, they're going to change it to the silver way. So instead of Albay, it's going to be Argenti, but it's the same organization. Okay, so the base mechanic, the core system in here, it is a percentile system, but it uses what they call the chill action table, and you're going to see that here in a second. But it's going to look very familiar to you, and that's because it really looks like the action results table that we've talked about with the Marvel Superheroes game, and then that was then adapted for Indiana Jones, for Conan. So again, if you saw that video, you've seen this table. They're also going to do like 3rd edition Gamma World's going to use that table. Later versions of Star Frontiers are going to use that table. It becomes like a bigger thing at TSR. Well, Mark Akers worked on Marvel Superheroes when that table was being created. So it stands to reason that they were going to use something very similar to that here. So using the table, you're rolling percentile dice, and you're going to compare your results based on different column shifts and figuring out whether your degree of success is limited, moderate, high, or complete based on how much you beat or missed your roll. And it's designed to kind of evoke that cinematic pulp horror. All right, so there's 2 roll types. There's general checks, which are simple pass fail versus an ability or a skill. And then there's specific checks where you consult the action table for success levels. Use that a lot for combat. And the design goal was really, they wanted to have a kind of a universal system that would work for any genre or for all actions. And the problem is, like, it gets a little clunky because there's a lot of subsystems. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit of the background on the game. And let's just go really quickly and look at how we start out. Now, one of the things that Pacesetter was really big on was this idea that you could play right out of the box without having to read a lot. So you see here, this says, read me first. So there was this like 8-page introductory folder. And right when you open the box, you could start playing without having to like memorize a bunch of rules. So that was a very innovative design choice at the time. And so a lot of people think that, you know, they'll degrade these games by saying that like they were made for kids. They're not made for kids. They're made for people that weren't used to playing role-playing games. I think it's fine. So I think this was a really kind of innovative thing for them to do. See the characters here. So now we're going to get into the actual game itself. And by the way, I love this art. So the guy with the lantern and like, I think it's super cool. So you can see that's done by Holloway, Jim Holloway. We've talked about him here. He did a lot of art for TSR over the years, but he's going to be one of the main art people that work on this, the covers for Chill. Okay, so you see your table of contents here, and it's the standard stuff you'd expect. Characters, how to make a character. You've got skills, your characters in action, damage and healing, supporting casts like animals, NPCs, and creatures, and then the art, which is their version of like, you know, kind of magic. And then running Chill. This is your game master section. How do you run a game? Okay, so characters in the game have 8 basic abilities that are rated on a score from 26 to 80. Strength, dexterity, agility, willpower, personality, perception, stamina, and luck. And luck is a player-only stat. And it can be spent or rolled to do things like avoid death or dodge harm or sway fate to your side. That kind of thing. And then you've got your derived abilities that come out of that, like your unskilled melee and your health scores are going to come out of your ability scores. So that 26 to 80, it's a really kind of wonky thing. You're going to roll 3d10 and then you're going to double it and then you're going to add 20, and that gives you your range of 26 to 80. This is so goofy. But, you know, I guess that made sense within the system at the time. So your skills are going to range from 41 to 135. And they're based on your abilities. So that's the thing. So you see your abilities here: strength, agility, dexterity. So that's the thing a lot of people complain about with this game, is like there was no reason to have those two split up. You've got willpower, you've got personality, perception, and then luck we talked about, and stamina. Okay. You've got your skills here that we talked about a second ago. So your skills are ranked. You've got your student, where you add plus 15. Your teacher, where you're supposed to add plus, I think it's plus 20. It's a misprint here in the game because it says plus 15 again for teacher. And then you've got master at plus 25. And then some skills like martial arts are going to cost double points to learn. And then you've got your skills kind of broken up into physical skills, professional skills, and social skills. All right. So you've got there, you see your combat skills. So combat is treated as a skill in this game as well, just like it was in Call of Cthulhu. Your research skills, all that kind of stuff that you would need. This is a little bit less about investigation. I mean, it is, but it's investigating in a different way. So the skills, as you can see here, are quite detailed. So each has its own kind of like little outcome chart. So you see here where it talks about limited success, moderate success, high success, and complete success. They do that for every single skill to explain how you use that in the game. And it makes the system a little fiddly, to be quite honest, because it's a lot that you have to memorize and look up during a game when you're making these rolls to see like what's going to happen. Okay, so now the other thing with your character creations is that all of your characters are going to belong to this organization safe. That's how the game is structured. So you're not an individual person that's coming to your characters all work together. And the reason they work together is because they're all part of this organization. So that's sort of like the built-in hook for you to go on these missions and adventures. So SAVE is like a global organization that combats the supernatural evils of the world. And characters, because they belong to this organization, are going to start out with gear and support. So it removes having to go shopping and the economy management of the game. So a lot of people, again, don't necessarily like that, but that was how the game was built. All right, so SAVE is providing like your mission structure for the game. So combat and resolution is based on that table. We'll talk about that in a second, but you've got your fear checks here, as you can see. So all these games kind of have this kind of aspect of like making a check for fear. So let's just talk about that. It's less essential than it is in Call of Cthulhu. It's more of like monster movie tension. So you're going to roll versus your willpower against a monster's fear rating. And again, you're going to look at that chill action table. And then the results are, if with failure, you're going to panic and flee. And then you can lose willpower. And then with success, you have reduced fear and you possibly can become courageous and then overcome it, right? So it's very distinct because it's temporary and it's recoverable and it's not like a long-term degradation over time. So it's not this slow march toward insanity that you get with the sanity aspects in Call of Cthulhu. This is just like you're scared for a second, but then you can recover and kind of move on. You know, a second loosely. I didn't mean like literally a second. Okay. So that's your fear. You've got surprise checks. You have distractions and then your combat. So combat is I'm going to be using that table. And initiatives rolled with a D10. There's a turn sequence where you use your art or your psychic or magical powers, use your ranged attacks, then you have movement, and then you have melee. And defenders can respond by either with counterfire or with melee defense. And then your attack rolls, well, you can use unskilled if it's a derived ability if you didn't take that skill, or you can use the appropriate skill if you put points into that skill. And so then the results on the chill action table are going to give you the damage severity, which whether it's scant or like a scratch or a critical wound, that kind of thing. Damage is going to reduce your stamina, which is your hit point equivalent. And then sometimes there's going to be bleeding or continued loss over time. So it's really not very narrative. It's not a narrative system. It's has like a wargamey feel. I think that makes sense considering that the folks who made this were coming from TSR, which was sort of built in the wargaming tradition. All right. So that's kind of the deal with combat. We'll get to that in a second. But now we're going to get into like the supporting cast, and it's going to talk about animals, and it's going to talk about NPCs and how to create them. Okay. And then it's going to get into the art. This is again, the magic system. So it's kind of split into three forms: communication, like clairvoyance. You've got restoration, like healing, and then you've got protection, like mental shields and wards. And then each form has three disciplines, which are learned separately. And there's a cost to it. And you can optionally spend some willpower to like boost your result. There's really no offensive powers in here. It's forcing your players to find non-magical solutions when they're encountering monsters. Okay. And then there's an evil way of art, and that's what you use for the villains. And there's 40 like dark disciplines like animate dead and things like that. And that uses willpower, and it's a whole different system. And that's one of the things with Chill is that there's a lot of times different systems for PCs versus NPCs. And that is a thing that a lot of people complain about with this game is having two different systems that you're keeping track of, and one of which is much easier to use than the other. But the tone of magic in Chill is it's more about psychic horror and occult powers than it is like fantasy magic. So it's closer to like ESP or psionics than it is to like real spell casting. So we talked about the fear system. So the tone overall of the game is really like 1950s to 1980s kind of horror cinema, cooperative monster hunting. It's less nihilistic than Call of Cthulhu is. And it's emulating those Hammer horror movies, the Universal monster movies, and kind of like Gothic Americana all rolled into one. So horror in this game is actually familiar. So Save knows that these things exist, and they specifically are sending agents out to go interact with them and figure it out. Whereas in Call of Cthulhu, you kind of stumble across things that you weren't meant to know. And like when you were sent on missions in Call of Cthulhu, you don't usually know what you're getting into. In Chill, you do. You know exactly what you're going after because Save is aware of these things and is sending people to deal with it. So players know the monster, but you have to role play being scared of it, okay? And then the rules are encouraging procedural monster investigation rather than just like free form tear that you get like in a Call of Cthulhu game, all right? It is designed to be easy for beginners, where you can just open the box, read that folder, and then start playing in 30 minutes or less. So it's one of the first, I'd say, approachable horror role-playing games that's out there. It was revived in future editions, second and third editions. They're going to be published actually by Mayfair Games because Pacesetter is going to go out of business in 1986. But Mayfair is going to take over the license and publish the future editions of Chill. I know they tried to do like a Kickstarter a while ago to try to resurrect it, and I don't think it succeeded. And so I think it's just kind of in hiatus right now. But you can find it like on DriveThruRPG and things like that. But it was very influential on like Buffy the Vampire Slayer sort of Monster of the Week type systems that are going to come much later. So here's that Chill action chart as I was mentioning, and you can see it's a very, very familiar look to the action results table. So this is a little bit of like some different adventures and ideas of things that you can do in the game. A quick look at that. You've got your animals and creatures here, as I mentioned. So this is all in the Game Master section. So as far as the adaptable mechanics from this that you can use in an OSR style system, I would say, again, those fear checks, kind of using them in a similar way that you'd use the reaction roll table, like that 2-die-6 table from an OSR game. You can adapt that for a fear type check. Again, I'm not a big fan of the player runs away because they're scared. I think that you can be much more creative with that, with the implications of being scared than running away. You could cower, which is not really that much different, but just ways to kind of not remove a player's from the game from being able to do anything. Using the monster hunting organization, obviously, as like a patron template for a role-playing game. It's a good idea. And there's a lot of stuff in here. The flavor of Save, you can use that and kind of adapt it to another game. Now, a few things that I really like in here are going to be the minor NPCs. So let's look at that section really quick here. So you see here, it's on the right-hand side, the minor NPCs are all the people that you can put into a chill adventure to give the setting atmosphere. But it gives you this table here you can roll on to see, like, what is this NPC like? Are they angry, annoyed, antagonistic, bored, brisk, bungling, closed, eager, efficient, flirtatious, friendly? All these different things. It gives you a quick look at how you can give an NPC some personality, like on the fly. And I really, really like that. I think it's a great thing. And these things, there's really no mechanics in here. So you can grab this and use it pretty much in any system that you want and give you a different NPC than you might not have thought of creating. So that's one. Another one I really like, and this isn't a mechanic, but it's the elements of horror. So you see it again over here on the right-hand page, and this is how to evoke horror in this type of game. And it talks about isolation and strange entrapments and mystery and reversal and teasing, all that kind of thing. And that's really helpful for trying to evoke horror in a certain type of game without making it be too dark and like I said, nihilistic, like a Call of Cthulhu game. So that is very useful for trying to evoke horror in a style of game. So I really like that. So again, I know I went through that quickly, but that's because we spent so much time on Call of Cthulhu, which really is kind of like the big 800-pound gorilla of the horror role-playing games. But that is Chill from 1984. I want to do a quick tribute here to two very important early founders, creators in the Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing game community. So the first one is going to be for Jennell Jaquays. I did a whole video when Jennell passed away in January of 2024. And Jennell's birthday is coming up, or the anniversary of her birthday is coming up. And it's actually the day that you're seeing this video. If you watched it on October 14th, 2025, her birthday was October 14th of, I believe, 1956. But Jennell was an artist and creator, writer for TSR in the early days, and did a lot of also very famous adventure modules like Caverns of Thracia for Judges Guild, as an example. So the reason this is important is not only to remember who Jennell was in the anniversary of her birth. Mark Clover from Creative Mountain Games has created a Jennell Jaquays Day on October 14th of every year. But this year, very, very importantly, Jennell's wife, who's a widow, is Rebecca Ann Heineman. And she is a very important person in the history of video games. And like if you've heard of Interplay in the video game community, that was her. She was one of the founders of Interplay, worked on Bard's Tale and a bunch of things like that. Well, she was just diagnosed with a very aggressive form of cancer just this month in October, and which is terrible. And she has a GoFundMe. And so if you are able to contribute to that, I will put a link down in the show notes below. And then the other creator and founder and of tabletop role-playing games I want to talk about is Gary Gygax. And there's a memorial game table for fans of Gary and Dungeons and Dragons in general that's being built in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. So it's a game table. It'll be outdoors in a park with a statue of Gary sitting at the head of the table, but it's designed so that people could sit down at this table in the park and play games together. I think it's a great cause if you're able to contribute. So that's a Kickstarter, and I will put a link to that below. Thank you so much. And let's continue our discussion of these different horror games by looking at Stalking the Night Fantastic. This is from 1983, so it does predate Chill by a year. And it was published by a little company called TriTac Games. And TriTac Games was founded actually way back in 1978. Originally, I think it was called Tacky Tack Games, and then they changed the name to TriTac later on. But it's founded by a man named Richard. I'm going to say Tucholka, although it could be Tucholka, which probably actually sounds more likely, but it's a Tucholka. And Richard created the company first off because he was a writer. He was working with a friend and had written, or was working on writing a book called a post-apocalyptic novel called The Morrow Project. If you're an old-time grognard and you've been around for a long time, like me, Gen Xer gamer, you've probably heard of the Morrow Project because it eventually is going to be published. He couldn't get the novel made, but he does turn it into a role-playing game once he discovers Dungeons and Dragons in 1979 and realizes that the Morrow Project would make a good setting for a game. And so he creates a company with some friends to publish the Morrow Project. That company eventually is going to fall by the wayside. There's going to be some falling outs with the founders. And Richard is eventually going to then create TriTac Games with one of his other friends, Robert Sadler, who's the other person that works on this Stalking the Night Fantastic game with him. So they're going to publish a few different games. There's going to be a science fiction game called FTL 2448. And then there's one of the first, or it might be the first, interdimensional travel role-playing games called Fringeworthy. And then, of course, you've got your horror game here, Stalking the Night Fantastic. So once again, you have a company very much in the same vein as Pacesetter that is going to be creating role-playing games, but not following in the tradition of creating a fantasy role-playing game, not competing with Dungeons and Dragons. So Stalking the Night Fantastic is, as we saw in Lawrence Schick's Heroic Worlds book that I went over at the beginning of the video, an eccentric supernatural horror game. It's set in the near future, and players are going to be agents of Bureau 13, an organization dedicated to fighting the growing influence of black magic and the supernatural. Now, unfortunately, Richard is going to pass away back in 2017. He died of cancer. Cancer sucks. But the company is technically still around, and his widow, Melody Natcher, is still publishing and distributing the works that TriTac Games made. So you can still buy these today. Now, the game is eventually going to be renamed to Bureau 13, which is the organization that the characters are going to work for. So it's a D100. It's a percentile system. It's very heavily detailed. The core resolution mechanic is just, rolling a d100 and applying statistics, skills, or difficulty modders, and a roll under the final target number then determines your success. So pretty basic system, it sounds like. But as we get into it, we see here, you've got your introduction and your terms and all that kind of stuff. But as far as making your characters, there are 17 different abilities, attributes, whatever you want to call them. Strength, constitution, dexterity sounds very familiar, but then they're going to split dexterity, and then there's also going to be an agility, and then you've got intelligence, wisdom, luck, you've got charisma, psionics, throwing, accuracy, dodge, resistance, hit points, magic, all these different ability scores, the way they're determined, and they're going to be on a range of 0 to 20, which you get by rolling 4d6 and subtracting 4. So that's their system. It's extremely granular. Lots of backgrounds, careers, skill point allocations. I mean, just look at all the detail here just to create your character. Now, see your skills. Look how tightly defined they are. Like it's a completely different font size almost. Because it's like there's so much on this page and there's so many different skills. There's hundreds of possible skills, and you see a lot of them overlap. Like if you want to take ceramics, you don't just take ceramics, you have to choose between classical or industrial ceramics. And if you want to take chemistry, you have to pick between general, organic, or inorganic chemistry. Like that's the level of detail that they're going for here. So over time, characters are going to discover and then try to dispatch these evil forces. And then they gain experience to both their abilities, and they're going to gain experience in their rank within Bureau 13. So you see that here. You've got on page 17 on the right-hand side, you have your experience points by level, but you also have your Bureau levels. These are almost like level titles from, Dungeons and Dragons, which makes sense because, D&D was the big game at this time that a lot of people would have started with. So combat resolution uses detailed hit locations. And I mean, when I say detailed, just wait until you see it here. But it gets really into all these different types of ways that your character can get hurt. Asphyxiation, there's animal attacks, and then the animal attacks are broken out by bite, claw, horn, sting, pincer, mandible, paw, hoof, tail, tentacle, and other, as an example. So you see there's different burn types here that your character can have, and they break it out. So contact, fire spread, lung damage, extinguishing fire, electrical damage, just on and on like this, just the amount of detail that is in here. It's pretty crazy. So then you're going to get into, there's radiation exposure, starvation, cold, toxins, vehicle impact. There's a large section on diseases here. And then we get into combat, and you've got, armor and choice of armor and armor mapping. So, and then you've got your weapons fire multiple hits and shot breakdowns and all this kind of stuff. Combat is, it's pretty, as you can see, it's very, very detailed. There's lots of different combat maneuvers and routines that you can take. And there's differences between the way PCs and NPCs have combat. So you see all that here with all the different weapons. And then you're going to get into your vehicles, and then you're going to get into your magic and your psionics. So the game's really kind of based more around paranormal and psychic abilities. But there's also magic, as you see. So it says magic is energy. The ability to use magic is the ability to summon energies and beings from this magic universe to aid in special areas of skill. So that's magic. And then you're going to have a whole description of how that works. And then your psionics, again, which is kind of a little bit more detailed, I think, than the magic system. But here you get into magic, which is broken out into black magic, gray magic, and white magic. But the way that magic affects you, as you see over here on the left-hand side, it says that if you use magic, any clergy or religious person will automatically treat you as if your charisma is 6 points lower if they know that you use magic. So they're giving you a cost for using magic, and that people, or religious people specifically, won't treat you as well because they don't like that you're using magic. It includes not only magic, but there's also like a bunch of stuff in here on like tech and gear and psionics and occult rules. And there's a focus on investigations, but like modern investigations and equipment, and then the agency support that you're going to get from Bureau 13. So the fear and insanity in here is much less defined than you see in other games. It's much less codified. The game's really more about tactical realism and procedural investigation. So I've heard it exclaimed by somebody that Stalking the Night Fantastic is really more of a toolkit for investigators and for GMs than it is a polished single rule system. And I think that is true. Like, there's a lot of ideas in here, but as a system, I think it doesn't really hold together well because it's trying to be too detailed while also at the same time not providing enough information to kind of run the game. But it does, it's pretty popular, I think, in the standpoint that it, it's going to have a legacy of creating this other game, Bureau 13, that gets multiple printings. So there was something about it that people kind of gravitated toward. So the tone, I'd say, is really sort of like a X-Files or Men in Black with a little bit of Ghostbusters and then Kolchak vibes, all kind of mixed together with like 1970s era, like paranoia and conspiracy theory kind of stuff. The PCs are going to be agents of Bureau 13, very much like in Chill, where they were agents of Save. But they're investigating paranormal problems like worldwide. That's how this organization works. And so your tone can range from like pulp monsters to conspiratorial occult horror and like everything in between. So not only did it spark the creation of a new edition with the Bureau 13 game, but it also there was a video game for Bureau 13. So that's how popular this was. Now, I think this is really funny here. And it's very much a sign of the times here on page 96. You see the note to parents. And it says, in the last 10 years, role-playing games have grown from a supposed fad to a permanent part of the world hobby industry. And these fantastic and imaginative games have come under attack from parents, groups, and religious leaders who claim role-playing is psychologically dangerous for our children. And then it talks in here about what are the benefits of role-playing games. And they're actually not harmful. They're helpful. Which is, again, just a sign of the times is that they felt that they had to defend the game. And then they're going to talk about witchcraft. It says, we do not support witchcraft or devil worship or the people who practice belief in such things. They felt it necessary to say that because those topics are addressed in the game, and they're trying to let people know, no, this is a game and these are forces that you're fighting, not forces that you're defending or trying to figure out how to use. So as far as things that you can use from this game, in an OSR style game, if you are one of those types of people who like hit locations, I am not one of those, but if you are one, these hit location tables that we saw earlier, I think, will be really helpful for you because they're so detailed and broken out. So you have all these detailed body areas in this map, and then like just look at the amount of detail on this page of like how you can be hit and where like head, chest, it goes into torso, arms, legs, abdomen, feet, hands, all that kind of stuff. If you're someone who likes that, you'll get a ton of like sort of gritty realism from those hit location tables. I'm not someone who likes to use those, but I know a lot of people do. I'm also a big fan of the Monster Banes, it's called. So it's over here on page 27. And it's talking about like when you're creating a monster, something that the monster might be, susceptible to. So you roll on this table here and it could be holy water or good magic or radiation or chemicals or sunlight or technology or wolfsbane or a special book or plant or specific gas, all these different things. I think those are great ideas to help make your monsters or your bad guys a little bit more unique in a game. It's like you can add some of these effects, these banes, to kind of help make them, like I said, a little bit more unique in your games. I really like the encounter catalog over here on page 28, where it goes through, different types of things that you might encounter in a horror game. And it's not just monsters. So that's what I really like about it. A lot of it is things like portals to other places. Or you've got, you can have vampires and that kind of thing, but you also have like weird human normals, they call them. And you can have things like cursed people or a weird disease or prehistoric animals that show up or clones. So it's a mix of actual creatures mixed with location and events. And I really like that. Lots of good ideas in here to help you kind of build out not just an encounter, but you could build a whole session out of that. And then I also really like the diseases. So as far as like providing information for you to know how to bring a disease into the game, So you've got your list of diseases here, your symptoms, how they're transmitted, and then it talks about like food poisoning, all that kind of stuff. Lots of good information here if you're someone who likes to make your diseases more than just, oh, it costs you some hit points or a constitution check and you're sick for a while. Like you can add much more detail by looking at that. So that is our look at Stalking the Night Fantastic. And let's just keep it going and look at our next game here, which is Beyond the Supernatural. So Beyond the Supernatural is published by Palladium Books, which is founded by Kevin Shimbida, Siembieda, I believe that's pronounced Shimbida, who was originally wanting to be a comic book artist, goes into commercial art, and then eventually is going to self-publish his own comic book that he wanted to get out there because he couldn't get it published by, like, say, some of the bigger companies like Marvel or DC. And he's also going to discover D&D in 1979 in the Detroit area and meet who's going to become like his sort of gaming writing creative partner, Eric Vucek. So Kevin is going to run a D&D game for that group at the university, Wayne Street University in Detroit, that he calls the Palladium of Desires. And it's sort of like a D&D riff or a derived game, and he wants to publish it, but nobody will really want to look at it except for Judges Guild, but they don't offer Kevin the amount of money that he thinks would make it worth it. So eventually he's going to start Palladium to self-publish the game. And that's how the game is going to get out there, the original game of Palladium, which is like going to determine the Palladium system, which is what Beyond the Supernatural is part of. So very much like Pacesetter kind of, or Chaosium kind of had a house system. Palladium system is also going to have its own system that works throughout all of their different role-playing games. So it's a percentile skill check system, but it also involves things like rolling d20s and rolling high during combat. It uses all the different polyhedral dice, not just percentage dice or not just d6s. There's class-based characters, and it's flexible, but it's very complex, and it's very math-heavy. It's very crunchy, and a lot of people will say it requires a lot of house ruling to run effectively. So it has occupational character classes, which are very similar to like D&D classes in a sense. And in this particular case, they're mostly based on playing as psychic characters. So in Beyond the Supernatural, the expectation for the most part is that you are going to be playing a psychic character. And your education and then your occupation, your occupational character class, are going to also help figure heavily into what skills and abilities that you have. So it's a very melee heavy system for combat, and it's very detailed. And again, it has like different damage types, like structural damage capacity, and you have mega damage capacity. It gets a little bit crazy. You see your rules here for insanity, so they're pretty detailed. It has some optional rules for figuring out things like birth order, weight, height, age, and disposition. And as far as like the magic in here, it's very psychic based. And this game is going to introduce something called the PPE, which is the potential psychic energy. And that's a system that is then going to be adopted by future Palladium games that involve this kind of like psychic ability. So it first debuts in this particular game. And it's a very early integration of psychic powers into horror gaming. Although, we did see that just a second ago with Stalking the Night Fantastic, which comes first. Beyond the Supernatural, I believe, is 1988, if I remember correctly. So you see all your different skill descriptions here. It's a D100 skill system. So, nothing really kind of out of the ordinary there. There's your hand-to-hand combat here. And it's broken up into basic, expert, martial arts, and assassin. And then you've got psychic combat. So combat is a big part of this particular game. Here's your psychic character classes. And they're all described here. So you've got arcanists and mages and latent psychics and natural geniuses and all that kind of stuff, the nega psychic. So the psychic classes, again, are pretty important to this particular game and setting. So you've got healers and things like that. I mean, you can see all of the different psychic classes. And then you have ordinary people, and it says optional. So the idea is, again, you're not going to be ordinary. You're most likely going to have psychic abilities. And then you've got all your different descriptions of your psychic abilities here. And then you do have magic. So it talks a little bit about magic and how that works in the game. But you see, it's a much less... the section's much smaller than is the section on the psychic abilities. So as far as like fear, insanity, and that kind of thing, it's really focused more on disbelief and psychic stress rather than traditional sanity loss. Although we did see those tables on insanity, but it's designed So the emphasis in the game is on modern psychological horror and hidden supernatural mechanics that support like a range of tones that go from like schlocky monster films to like intense psychological horror. So you can kind of go any direction that you really want with this. So it's really, I'd say it's sort of like 1980s TV horror realism as far as the tone. Your PCs are playing modern investigators, psychics, researchers, that kind of thing. And the setting implies a secret world of monsters that the public doesn't really understand or isn't even aware that exist. And then the supplements kind of expand on that if you want to add more flavor and more monsters and things like that. So the legacy of this is part of that Palladium system, but it's really going to influence games like Rifts as far as like that potential psychic energy, and the PPE really factors into like future games like that. There's going to be a second edition of Beyond the Supernatural. And as far as things that you can take from this game and then use in your OSR style games, well, Ley Lines and Magic Places, where I stopped here, is a good one. So it talks about places of power. And I think that's a really underutilized thing in Dungeons and Dragons and how to use that. And there's a whole section on it here. And I think, you can get inspired by it. And also because Palladium was sort of originally based on D&D, you can, I think, much easier than some other games, take some of the ideas mechanically and adapt them quickly to Dungeons and Dragons. So I really like a couple other things in here we'll go over. So there's a section here on playing the victim, which I really, really like. Because it gives you ideas on saying how, like, usually you're the hero, but sometimes it's fun to play that person that you don't know who's going to survive. Like when you're watching a horror movie, if there's like hero types, that they're going to make it through. But if everybody is just like, a college student or something like that, you never know who's going to die. And so it talks in here about giving you ideas on how to role play that once in a while. And then it's fun to do that. And I really like that. Now, another thing I really like here is the character background, which is optional, but it gives you ideas for how to like bring characters to life, especially like NPCs, if you're a GM, quickly, and give them sort of like make them stand out. So you roll on a table and they could be just curious, or they might have witnessed something supernatural to cause them to do what they're doing. Or maybe there was a traumatic change that they went through. Maybe they're haunted. Maybe they were befriended by a mystic or a ghost, or they're really just a fraud artist, or, there's all these different things. And it gives you a reason for like why your character wants to investigate these kinds of supernatural horrors. So these character backgrounds can be used for PCs and for NPCs. And I think that can be really helpful for, making characters be more than just like cookie cutter types. All right. So that's a very quick look at both Stalking the Night Fantastic and Beyond the Supernatural. So that's been our look at these 4 early horror tabletop role-playing games, and really looking at how each game tackles horror differently. From, the nihilistic helplessness in Call of Cthulhu, you have sort of the more heroic aspect, I would say, in Chill. You've got the conspiracies happening in Stalking the Night Fantastic, and then you have the more psychic-based overview and tone that you get from Beyond the Supernatural. But the common thread in that all these games is that they were experiments in trying to figure out how to turn fear and horror into some kind of game impact, whether that's mechanics or just tone and narration. So with looking at these 4 games, I think we've seen how horror has evolved from sort of the cosmic dread to more like cinematic monster hunts and like everything in between, and how much these early systems do have to teach us about how to implement horror in a role-playing game. So in the future, my next video for my October 2025 horror theme is going to be about a supplement for 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons called Mask of the Red Death. And what's going to be very special about this is that I interviewed its creator, author, William W. Connors, who was sort of the shepherd of the Ravenloft line during the 2E era. But this isn't like a standard interview talking head kind of thing. It was all done via email and via chat. But William is going to answer a lot of questions about what was happening at TSR, the company at the time when that supplement was published, and how it came about. So you're going to get this behind the scenes look that you're not going to get on other channels, talking about the history of TSR and how it impacted the D&D supplements that we started to see coming out in the 90s time period before the eventual collapse of TSR. So please stay tuned for that video. I hope I'm really excited about it. And I think it's a very, very fun setting. It's a unique look at using using D&D mechanics to evoke a late period, sort of Victorian era 1890s time period. And I really like that because I think it shows how the system can be adapted for certain types of things that you want to accomplish. All right, so that's going to be coming up next. But as for this video, that's going to wrap it up. And I really hope that you enjoyed it. And please go into the comments and let me know which of these games you like the best of these four, or maybe there's a game that you want me to cover and I can add it to my list and then maybe feature it in my October 2026 horror themed videos. So leave all that in the comments below. And then while you're down there, you'll find places to join me on social media. You'll find links to my blog. You'll find ways that you can support the channel. I already talked about two, which was my Patreon and also ordering merchandise from either my spread shop or my Redbubble shop. But you can also become a super fan and join this list of other fine folks who contribute to a lot of them every single video. They contribute financially as a way to say thank you for all of the time and effort that goes into me researching, recording, and editing and publishing the videos. And I really appreciate all of your help for people that are able to do that, to say thanks. And then you can also order my supplement, Alchemy, Explosives, and Inventions, an old school D&D supplement for playing expert style characters with class concepts and three brand new classes: alchemists, demolitionists, and inventors. New equipment. It's got a 3-story guild hall with maps, NPCs, and secrets, rumors, adventure hooks, all that kind of stuff. It's available as a PDF or as a print-on-demand document with either a parchment or plain white background at Drive-Thru RPG. All those links will be down in the show notes below. But that's going to wrap up this video. So I'd like to say thank you very, very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. All right, now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to, and I made my notes for this video. So I am going to have to be a little quick this time because my editing software, again, only lets me do up to 2 hours, and I am right at the edge here, I believe. But I'm going to move the wreck out of the way because I don't want to accidentally spill on it. But as far as drinking, I was having this Nitro Milk Stout. This is by Left Hand Brewing, and they're located in Colorado. And, you know, it's October. It's mid-October by now. Weather's getting cooler. I feel like it's a good time to drink stouts. I don't like to drink stouts in the summer. But yeah, so you probably could hear that. Now you're supposed to pour this hard out of the bottle to release the nitro action. The problem is I don't want to drink the whole beer right now. And I just spilled it. I knew that was going to happen. But so you want to pour it hard out of the bottle so that it can create the head on here, which is what you're looking for with this kind of beer. So this is a very highly rated nitro stout. I think it got 92 points on Beer Advocate, but it's very creamy. It's got kind of those coffee notes and some milk chocolate notes. It's very, very smooth. One of the smoothest beers I've ever had. So cheers. It's like 6% ABV. So it's a little on the low side, kind of medium low. And, give it a try. See if you can find it or other milk stouts. Maybe if you've never had a milk stout before, again, give them a try and see what you think. Cheers. All right, so I'm going to move that out of the way now. Just briefly talk about this record. You guys all saw it at the beginning here. This is the Empire Strikes Back soundtrack. So this is an original pressing from 1980, and this came through my friend's shop. So I mentioned before, I work at a record shop in Burbank. I just help my friend out like one day a week, called Run Out Groove Records in Burbank. And so this came through, and I priced it. And I cleaned it. He has a very fancy cleaner called a degritter. And I even wrote, so this is my writing. I said, it includes the booklet. And I graded it very good plus for both the sleeve and for the vinyl. So this is the booklet that I was referring to. So a lot of the times this booklet is missing when you price these older records or see them come through. It's been ripped out. But this had that. And the vinyl is in fantastic shape. So you can see it's, that's from 1980. There's not a scratch on it. So anyway, my wife bought it for me for my birthday. She went into my friend's shop and she's like, "Is there anything in here that Martin would like for his birthday? That's not like on his list." And they knew that I didn't have this, and so it's a double LP. And so my wife bought it and surprised me with it. So she wrapped it up, and I think it's hilarious because like I didn't notice that it had the sticker on it with my handwriting. And so I was like, oh, that's so funny. Like I just priced one of these at Jeff's shop like a few weeks ago and it sounds really great. And she's looking at me like I'm crazy. And then I finally noticed the note and I was like, oh, I see. This is the one. So both my friend Jeff and my wife knew I wanted this. So the only real problem with this is it's not a problem, but you can see there's just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of ring wear on the sleeve. But the record itself sounds amazing. There's no surface noise, no crackles. So it's technically closer to a near mint plus, but when we grade at his shop, we tend to grade a little bit more conservatively, just because we want people to be happy. So anyway, Empire Strikes Back is my favorite of the Star Wars movies. Still to this day, of all the movies, it's still my favorite. And I remember getting the action figures when I was a kid and being so excited to get them. I got the action figures before I'd even seen the movie, so I didn't know what all the snow stuff was about. And this is the 45th anniversary this year. 2025 is the 45th anniversary of Empire Strikes Back. So if you haven't listened to it for a while, give it a spin. I've been fortunate enough to see it performed live in concert at the Hollywood Bowl before, where they showed the movie and then they have the live orchestra. And that was amazing. And so if you ever do get a chance to see it live, give that a try. So thanks for sticking through the bonus content. Hope you enjoy the rest of the video, and cheers, and I'll talk to you next time.